Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. We are so glad you've joined us for this Church Goes Global webinar. My name is Andrew Gale.
And I am Nate Tatman, and we are so thankful that you've joined us today. And before we get started in today's topic, we just wanted to remind you of why we invest this time, our time and our energy to bring you these conversations about the church and how you can engage during this webinar.
So Church Goes Global looks at cross-cultural issues through the lens of the local North American church engagement. And our hope is to invite guest speakers to share their experience, protect local church.
And if you've never been a part of a Zoom webinar before, here are a few pieces of information that may be helpful to you. First, this session is being recorded and can be found on the Global Strategy Resource page and their Facebook page in the coming week. Second, questions are welcomed and encouraged, and feel free to write those questions and send it in at any time. They will not be visible to the rest of the participants, but Andrew and I will be able to see those. And there are other features like polls that we may utilize as well. And so we want as much participation from you all as possible. Our next webinar will be on October 30th at 2 p.m. and our guest will be Al Steiner. Al is part of an organization that goes into different countries, and they work with local church planters and pastors on starting small businesses for self-sustaining themselves and their families, as well as their churches and ministries. And it'll be a great opportunity to learn from Al, to hear from him, and opportunities on ways that your church can engage in that as well. And so we hope that you can join us on October 30th.
And today we are joined by Jyl Hall Smith. Jill's a professor. She's an international development leader, a recent PhD graduate. Congratulations, Jyl. And today she's going to share with us some about her research that looks at the intersection of poverty, faith, and politics. So Jyl, before we get started, where are you joining us today? Where are you located in the world?
I'm in Dayton, Ohio, just right outside the city, actually, in a little suburb of Dayton.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we have churches that we work with a lot that are right in that area. So, well, I first connected with Jyl when we were both attending Asbury, doing education stuff. But could you tell us, kind of, Jyl, what you've been at Asbury, just finished graduating, but what were you doing prior to that? What led you to doing more education?
Yeah, well, exactly prior to that, I was a missionary with my husband. We got married during my career. I worked for about 20 years with nonprofits and humanitarian organizations. And we met, and when I was in the midst of that, and he had been a missionary for about 10 years, so I went with him to a little country called Macedonia. And then we decided to move back with our one child at the time, and then I had another one while I was studying. And, you know, I was interested again, and it was my second time at seminary to try to study God's heart for the poor, something that's just been a lifelong interest for me.
That's very cool. That's very cool. And we are grateful that you're with us today, and we're grateful that we get to process some of that together.
Yeah.
So one of the things, you put together a presentation for us that kind of goes through some of what you did with your dissertation research, kind of looking at Christians and their views on poverty. So I want to just pass it off to you and let you share with us. And then again, if there are any questions from the people that are listening, feel free to write those, send those in, and we will make sure that we ask those as we get to the end of this presentation. So Jyl, I'm going to give you the floor so we can hear about this research you did.
Great. Is that coming through there?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I did a case study in an instance where poverty was spiking a lot, and in this case it was Dayton, Ohio, and how Christians respond when there's a specific context of spiking poverty. And I found that you really can learn a lot about people when you study their thoughts on economics and how people kind of interact with poverty and economics as a whole. So I wasn't living at Dayton at the time when I started to study this issue of poverty here. And in the year 2000, Dayton, Ohio was considered hunger-free. And that's a USDA designation that it means essentially there's enough safety nets that hunger can be reduced to the point where there's always a place to go when food is needed when one is hungry. It would be difficult to eradicate it completely, but as much as public-private partnerships can create, it was one of the first cities to adapt that kind of principle. And Dayton is, very much a blue-collar town. It's like a small Detroit. So offshoring and use of robotics occurred before even the millennium and had been kind of going on since the 70s. And so politicians and leaders and church leaders got together and had the development forethought to kind of address poverty as it was starting. Fast forward to 2015, Dayton was the second high. There was a total change. This program wasn't going on anymore. Different leadership, different programs going on. Dayton's second highest hunger nationally by 2015 for families with children. And it's such like a shocking statistic. I really wanted to dive into that and probably do my dissertation research on it. It has a number of unhappy distinctions as well. It's the first highest city for African-American infant mortality. And infant mortality in the US in general for African-Americans is lower than some developing countries like Bangladesh, but is even lower than that here in Dayton. And, that's something I could speak to if anybody has a question about that. It's one of the most segregated cities in the US. The city is kind of very split down the middle. One side is Black and one side is white, but church attendance overall is 43%. There's been some strides made since 2015, but especially since people learned of this issue. But, Dayton, the kids here in my little suburb right outside of Dayton, which is Kettering, we just found out there's a 47% hunger risk rate for kids when they go home for the weekend and they don't have school lunches and that kind of thing, which is just way higher than national averages and disturbing. So you think about all that's going on with Dayton. There's a heroin problem. We just had these shootings in the city. We just had these tornadoes. Dayton, the kids here are really hurting. And I'm interested in how the church thinks about that and interacts with that. And I'm very interested in these public justice structures around these issues, but there's also spiritual problems. So I don't want to make light of that because that's a serious issue here. And we really need prayer and, people to come minister in Dayton. Dayton used to be a test market. So for example, McDonald's pizza was tested in Dayton. And people would test different products in Dayton because it was just considered a cross-section of America. It was statistically average in every way and was a thriving middle-class town. That's now moved to Columbus, where as a test market city, Columbus is doing amazingly well. And starting decades ago, politicians had some real great development forethought that helped it to be a thriving city. But I wonder, and this isn't something that I did study statistically, but if Dayton was considered the most average city of America at one point, is this kind of a bellwether for where the nation is going with poverty? And bellwether, it also was a bellwether city, meaning however Dayton voted would be how you would see how the country would vote in general. Nationally, the statistics in the US, so this isn't Dayton, this is just a picture of US poverty to kind of put into perspective some of the things I'm talking about. A fifth of all households experience hunger on a regular basis. 1 in 4 children are at risk of hunger every day, which is just an incredibly high number for a wealthy nation. And 20 million Americans live in extreme poverty, with 47 million individuals living beneath the poverty line, which varies depending on where you live and the number of children in your household. So the thing that's most important with the statistics about poverty in the United States is 60% of the people experiencing hunger are working full-time. 90% of the people who are experiencing hunger have worked in the last year. And people Christians in general tend to think of poverty a certain way, as my research showed that I'll get into, but people tend to think of people who are, homeless and that kind of thing. And that represents a specific part of poverty. And sometimes that has to do with people who may have been employed recently. But what I'm looking at most often is working class poverty that's hidden, and that nobody knows that people can't make ends meet because they're in the daily grind trying to make ends meet, but it's just not happening. So some of these things, that occur to create poverty, of course, you have this amazing loss of jobs. Dayton also has a major public transportation issue, and there's some really interesting anecdotes with that. But Harvard did a study and found that the number one way for people to get out of poverty, working class poverty, is good public transportation. So transportation or having a car, one of the main issues with poverty. So Dayton has a transportation problem. They just closed one of their main hospitals. Healthcare is a main issue. Poor nutrition just snowballs into further healthcare issues. And there's a housing problem, which is why there's more people coming to the suburbs, and our hunger is growing as well because housing is cheaper and healthier. So there's all kinds of people. Dayton has an amazing public health program that studies many of these things. And when I started to delve into this issue with poverty in Dayton, I think there's great data on why this is happening. I want to know why people think this is happening, and what do they know that it's happening? Do they know that it's the second highest place for hunger in the country? So I made 15,000 phone calls, not me, I did it with a research group, not me by myself. I interviewed 23 leaders, that I did by myself, and had 3 focus groups. And I got a tremendous amount of data on a number of things, but I just want to highlight some of the main points, which is that Christians are 2 to 3 more times more likely to blame the poor for their poverty. And that's correlated with 3 specific things that I would kind of drill down into with people's answers, which is individualism, ethnocentrism, and authoritarianism. Individualism is much higher in the church, and there's some really interesting stuff that I wrote about all of this that's in my 2nd chapter of my dissertation. If anybody be interested in reading some of that, I won't go too long into those issues, but I think Andrew has a copy of the dissertation if anybody did want to read more on that. And basically it's sort of this, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you're poor, you're lazy. Egocentric individualism, and I wrote a brief definition here where the individual is completely responsible for their own success and considerably more significant than the whole. So that idea, I'm sure you've heard multiple sermons on the problem of individualism in the country and in our culture, but it's significantly concentrated in the church, and there's a long historical reason for why that is, which I talk some to in the dissertation as well. But this book, Divided by Faith, specifically looks at that. Some of you probably read it. To me, it's just required reading for Christians. It's one of the most important books I ever read, and it correlates individualism with ethnocentrism, which of course is racism. And, not the type of racism that's easily identified, but sort of a blaming of out groups, and kind of seeing all issues as resolved through individual initiative or interpersonal relationship, that kind of thing, charitable aid, or, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It goes deep into it. It's fascinating. And I added to that equation authoritarianism, which is a really interesting social distinction, and really doesn't have any low hanging fruit. Unfortunately, it's causes a lot of problems, and I learned so much about it in this research process. But essentially, it's kind of black and white thinking, aggression towards out groups, and tends to struggle with a lot of there's a lot of side effects, let's just say, from it, and I'll just go on from there. So Let's look at my notes really quickly. Essentially what I found with this is that faith ends up being kind of mechanistic, where people are legitimizing this divinely sanctioned order where people who are bad experience misfortune and people who are good experience fortune. And the worldview is entrenched to what, you know, you have known and experienced in your own life. And the problem is that can really obscure these public issues that I mentioned, like healthcare, wages, and transportation. Another question I wanted to pose to you guys is, what would you guess the charitable aid versus public aid would be towards the hunger problem? Just if I was in a classroom setting, I would give people a chance to answer, but I'll just give you a moment to think of what statistic you would guess that to be in your head. And some people, you know, generally people tend to think that public aid, which would include all individual giving, all charities, all churches, all philanthropic endeavors and foundations, etc., versus government aid towards hunger. Generally, people think of charity as kind of involved more in food banks and that kind of thing. But the actual breakdown is that 97% of hunger aid is given by the government and 3% by churches. And so when you look at hunger as a result of something like transportation, that's not an issue that churches can solve. And these are public issues and they're justice issues. And the church tends to be very much politically involved when it's something that they feel passionate about, such as abortion and that kind of thing. And certainly I understand that, but there's all these other issues that go into our daily lives that are public issues that really require that we participate in and we benefit from, but may not see that how we're voting creates these inequalities in these other areas. And the number one issue fueling abortion is poverty. So it's really a pro-life issue all around. And it's important for the church to be educated on these issues, because how we advocate has a huge difference. What the church cares about and publicly has outcries about affects things. You know, advocacy is incredibly effective, and of course, voting is incredibly effective. And, you know, something I like to say, just in ending my kind of overview of the research, is that I like to say that the government is definitely not the doctor and the government is not the priest, but they pave the roads for the houses of both to be built on. And we all want clean water and paved roads and justice and equality of opportunity for people to succeed. So both sides, I would say, you know, conservative and liberal, the goal is self-sufficiency in that everybody can together be able to feed their family, able to be a contributing member of society, but there's this interdependence and civic issues that allow that to happen. And we have a theology that sometimes blinds us to those things and, you know, unfortunately can allow for poverty like this to flourish in the United States. The other thing is that, you know, we tend to glamorize poverty overseas. And in my work in humanitarian organizations, I traveled to 50 countries and worked in poverty initiatives all over the world. And I would say that certainly there's different levels of starvation and malnutrition, but poverty has the same causes anywhere you go. And if you look at the countries with the most extreme poverty, 100% of the time it's correlated with very low to no governance. There's either absolute corrupt governance or there's no government whatsoever, such as Democratic Republic of the Congo or, you know, Haiti, that kind of thing. And North Korea, of course, serious starvation issues, really bad governance. So these kind of public ways we live together are really tied to these civic issues. And you know, we need Jesus also in a place like Dayton to come in, but there has to be a transformation. I mean, not need Jesus, we need Jesus only. And I believe that Jesus would I believe Jesus did talk about speaking to the powers and about justice. And, we need evangelists and advocates here. So I think that's all I wanted to say so far about that research, and I'm open to questions and thoughts.
Oh no, sorry, I had to unmute. It took me a second. Hey, thank you. That is so helpful. It's just fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me. I think these are conversations that don't often happen in the church, but are conversations that need to happen in the church. And I'm keenly aware of the times that I think about issues in very simplistic ways and not recognizing the systems at play in what's happening. And one of the things one of the questions that I had that I wanted to pose to you is, I've heard this imagery that's been given in a number of different ways, but this idea that this person's living on a river and this body floats down that has obviously been there's violence that's happened, and so they pull the body out of the river and they try to help the person and care for them. And then a couple days later, another body comes down, they pull that body out of the river. And for years, they spend time pulling bodies out of the river, but they never walk up the stream and figure out what's happening that's causing the bodies to come down the river, and how important it is for us to recognize that, yeah, we can do charitable good, but there are also systems at play that if we avoid those systems or don't recognize those systems, we may miss out on opportunities to affect it at a larger level. So yeah. I think a lot of our churches fall into that category. We tend to deal with the mending and the helping and not the system. So what's something you would recommend a church do, like a first step to move from I'm just helping on this small level to trying to advocate on a larger level?
Yeah, I think that I love that illustration that we tend to be reactionary instead of getting to root causes here. I mean, one of the root causes certainly is we're good at soul care, but we don't look at these structural root foundation issues. And yeah. An organization I really love that really simplifies advocacy is Bread for the World. And that's all they do is they teach churches how to advocate, and they constantly have campaigns. It's sort of like an Amnesty International for Christians. And okay. They might have a couple issues that, are not your bag, that, maybe go into things that are not on your heart or not in your kind of theological backpack, but they do some excellent things on poverty, really, really good things. And they represent a wide swath of churches and faith expressions in Christianity. So they're always doing campaigns. They have great projects for churches to do, and I really like them a lot. Their website is bread.org. Okay,
awesome. And I put up a poll there just really quickly just to get people's thoughts on whether they have ever kind of contacted an elected official. That's, I think, something that, we have the capacity to do. I think I actually heard you, Jyl, say at one time how many letters that it takes to an elected official for them to start doing research on an issue, and that it's a lot less than what we think that it is. And so, being engaged and knowing who our elected officials are and engaging them can be a helpful start.
Sure is.
Do you remember how many letters did you say that it was? Do you remember?
It was 7 letters. And okay. That was 15 years ago, before texting became as popular, but emails are so easy, you probably could double it or triple it. And if they get, let's say, 15 emails or letters on a subject, they'll assign a staff person to that issue and research, what they're going to do about it and the importance to their constituency. Sometimes political leaders are just not educated on some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, a church could do that. A church could say, "Hey, we're all gonna connect our elected official on this issue of poverty in this community," and that could start a conversation that may not happen without that impetus.
Yeah.
Somebody asked or wanted some clarification on the percentage that you had mentioned in terms of, I believe it was the charity aid versus hunger aid, the 97%.
Yeah.
The 3% churches. Was that just in Dayton, or was that on a national scale?
That is national. And I also meant to say that I do have the references and data for all this stuff in my document. And I wanted to mention also that with that number of 97% is that they're, increasingly cutting benefits like SNAP, and they're looking at cutting it so much, there's just no chance that the church could foot the bill for that leftover amount. And you think about, if most of the people who are hungry are working, it's not that, I'm advocating for the government just feeds people, but also that they can adjust things that working people can feed their families. So you need both charitable aid, and you continue to have SNAP, because like in my community, 47% of kids are hungry on the weekends. I mean, that's crazy. So you have to have both of those things, but we also have to push that number down through better public structure.
You mentioned the book Divided by Faith. If a church wanted to start a conversation in their community, is that a book you would recommend they start with? Or what's a good first?
Oh, that's an excellent book. That's an excellent book.
Okay.
Yeah, really good. Just life-changing book.
Awesome.
And it's a quick read, and it gives some historical background to some of our individualism and that kind of thing, and how it creates ethnocentrism. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Getting down into, I guess, just thinking through local church ministries, you hear a lot, or I know of a lot of churches that will have like a food pantry where they help people with, or they offer, garden plots and different things like that. What would you, I guess, just wanting to get your advice or thoughts on best practices for churches who offer those?
I totally fully support that 100%. I in no way, because I emphasize some of the structural issues that create poverty, in no way suggest we don't also need charity and benevolence programs. Just after this, I'm going to a groundbreaking for a nonprofit grocery they're opening in Dayton, because it's also a food desert, which is an interesting concept in poverty. But I very much support churches having, programs to help, because it's a huge issue, and it's a great way to build relationships and kind of understand more about why this is happening, especially when you're getting to know single moms, that kind of thing.
And what would you have with your research, or maybe just firsthand knowledge or experience? Are there some best practices or some things that you've seen that have worked really well? One of the things that I hear a lot of, against food pantries is, well, you get people that are always looking for a handout and that sort of thing. You're not really helping people get beyond where they're at now. What have you seen, or what would you speak to that?
I mean, these people are hungry, and if you ever have a fasting, we're trying to figure out how to do a citywide fast to raise some money for a backpack program we have here, for people to feel like what it feels to be hungry, and to imagine a kid going a weekend with no food, and I don't understand how, nobody can support a life based on free food. You also have to have shelter, you got to have clothes, you got to have medicine, and nobody's going to say, I'm just not going to work because I can get free food. Well, there's a number of other things at play there. So food is just fundamental. People need food. And, I know that the books Toxic Charity and that kind of thing are really popular right now. I'm not really a fan. I like data-based books, like what does the research show? And nothing can be corroborated. It's development 101, because Andrew studied development as well. He knows this, that you create a sustainable program. So like community gardens, or this grocery that we helped to start, that is a co-op. So people buy shares, even if it's $10 into the grocery, and then they have a membership and they can get food at reduced prices and that kind of thing, or work at the grocery store. Sustainable efforts are always what you want to do to create long-term poverty relief. But the most sustainable effort is that people have a job. Like my grandmother was a single mother through no choice of her own of 5 kids. And sometimes they ate ketchup sandwiches, but they just got by. You know, nowadays for a woman to work full time, she worked for the phone company, you're going to go without food all the time. And so the justice issue is that's got to stop. I mean, we got this huge evangelical community in this country. What are we advocating for? What are we having public outcry about? And for the big focus to be on just stop giving people stuff because it's creating dependency is not a research-based view. That's not what the data shows. So, and I fear it enables this attitude of blaming the poor for their poverty. You know, people, even some leaders of some wonderful nonprofits here get burnt out, and that's easy to do when you're staring at, you know, really difficult situations all day, every day. But simplistic answers or blaming people, I mean, sure, everybody's got like a cousin who's on the take or knows of a cousin who's on the take and they're getting food stamps and they shouldn't. But we found that fraud is actually 3% of all actual loss in these kind of government programs. So sure, we want to reduce the need for them, but that means people need to have a job where they can feed their families. They need to be able to pay their medical bills. And we did that. You know, it's so doable. People think it's just this elusive, impossible thing to do. And I really think it's not.
And I think somebody else asked this question. I think you kind of answered it there, but I think they're thinking beyond just helping with food. But the question is, how do I differ between who is in genuine need and who is looking for a handout? Does it even matter? Should we just give it to all or help all? And I think some context there may be thinking through if somebody's looking for help paying a rent or utility bill or maybe something else as well, beyond just food.
Right. Well, you get into that at churches, that you get a lot of people coming in and asking for help. And, you know, I would say always offer food no matter what, because you don't know if they have kids at the home and that kind of thing. People also look at our drug problem here in Dayton and they would say, well, they're on drugs, that's why they're hungry. But I spoke with this, when I was interviewing leaders, one of the interesting answers I got about, so is it individual initiative or is it outside issues, was essentially one of the first questions I was asking people. And he said, there's a way for outside issues to rob people of an individual initiative. And people working with working class people find that if you're chasing 50-cent raises a year after year, you start to lose hope. And a lot of the people actually dying of heroin overdoses they're finding is white men who are finding that they can't make ends meet and they sort of lose hope, you know, and that the death rate of working class white men is skyrocketing because of, you know, over suicide and drug use and alcoholism because of this whole changed landscape economically. And so my point is, I know that there's people who come into churches and maybe they're on drugs and that kind of thing, but I would just, you know, your discernment's going to let you know if it's somebody who wants you to pay a rent bill year after year and they're not looking to improve their lives. But with single mothers, 9 out of 10 times they need help, and you know, I would say just help them. It's not, our main worry shouldn't be who's taking advantage and who isn't. Our main worry should be 1 in 4 kids go to bed hungry in this country. So you do some benevolence programs, sure, and you deal with individual issues, but we got to galvanize towards these big issues as well.
You know, one of the things you said that I know, I mean, it makes sense, but it's not something that I have processed a lot, is how interconnected these issues are. That sometimes we focus on just one issue or just another, but oftentimes they interplay with one another. And you brought up the idea of poverty and abortion, but I think that's true for a lot of different issues. That, you know, minimum wage issues play into food because of how much people are making. And so how does a church decide, is it good for a church to say, we're going to be a part of dealing with this issue? or how do they go about making a difference when there's so many different components that play into that? Does that, it can feel kind of paralyzing. So, you know, where does a church start?
Yeah. I mean, I would say just discern what your issue is going to be. Is it going to be immigration? Is it going to be, hey, I found out about this transportation issue. I'm working with a group that we decided this Kettering hunger over the weekend thing is something with kids we're going to focus on, and you know, just go deep into that issue. And Bread for the World has constant letter writing campaigns. You can write letters on a number of things, and we call our public officials on issues that concern us often, and we always get, we meaning my husband and I, we always get letters back and phone calls back and that kind of thing.
That's great.
Well, and I think too, just to kind of speak to that, I think what this communicates is that it's so important for the local church to understand the needs of their community, of the neighborhood, of the city that they are planted in. We can't just be concerned about the spiritual needs, but we also have to be concerned about the physical needs and emotional needs of, again, the community in which you're a part of. And so, you know, I think more than anything, it's, you know, when Andrew, when you ask that question, it's finding out what are the needs outside the doors of your church, you know, and you can begin to pinpoint what it is that God has planted you, you know, where God has planted you, and the needs based upon what's outside of your church doors.
And then, but then also being okay when it's not a simplistic response. And I think that's where it can sometimes be, because we want all you have to do is give one bag of groceries and everything will be better. You know, we want, or you know, but we realize, I think the realization that it's going to be more complex than that. And we can do little things to help along the way, but making an impact is a long-term commitment, you know, to making change.
Yeah, there's really not, I mean, believe me, it's a burden. Like it's all I think about all the time. And of course it's all I researched and all that stuff. And for years and years, it's just, I worked in this, and there's not easy answers. And, you know, I am curious as to, I mean, God loves the poor. He talks about it more than any other subject in the scriptures. It's where he wants us to be, and it's messy. And there's a lot of unanswered questions, but he wants us in there. And that's just the way it is. I mean, in the midst of doing all this research, I don't think I would have said this, but I would say this living here now. We also need some old-fashioned street preachers in Dayton spreading the word, because of all these issues are causing a lot of despair there. Shootings, hurricanes. We had a Ku Klux Klan rally this summer that cost the city millions of dollars to protect, you know, a handful of people that it did not have to spend. So that's money diverted from other things. It's just, you know, we need all kinds of prayer and missionaries, and but also public outcry, like Jeremiah, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece. Is we need our pastors and our congregation people to be missionaries, to see themselves as missionaries in the communities they're a part of, you know, and in the best sense of the term missionary, you know, to be anthropologists, to be culturally aware, and to be sensitive and engaging and trying to learn and understand, because, you know, that's the way that you get to make an impact, is by understanding. So I think that's great. Well,
what about going back to, again, my filter is usually the local church, and in terms of the church that's on the ground and, you know, on a city block. What about the church that's in a more affluent area, or maybe that doesn't see the needs right outside their doors? Maybe they're in a rural area as well. What would you say to those churches?
I would recommend, you know, I mean, you just see, let's say, regardless of where you're at on this issue, you can guess where I'm at on the issue. But let's say you were talking about immigration, and you look at the advocacy from churches against it. and the public attention that gets from president, leaders, that kind of thing. Pick an issue, raise your voices, you know. And so I am repeating myself there, but there's a church here that does huge benevolence program. It's a mega church in the suburbs. And, you know, these are things that just keep, and building relationships is important. I think, I mean, even with, as I interviewed some of the leaders of the biggest church kind of charitable wings, I would find answers that kind of looked at people need to work hard or they need to get a job. And they'd say, you know, if that single mom can't make it on 2 jobs, she needs to get a 3rd, you know, which is like, well, the problem is she can't make it on 1 job, you know, she's got those kids, and then they'll say she needs to go back to school. When does any single mom have time to do that? Especially if you're talking about not having a car or a computer and that kind of thing. So why I told you that is that there's also the aspect of building relationships where people kind of missiologically, like Andrew was saying, kind of understand the perspective of what their life is like. And in those relationships, not having simple solutions to their issues, but walking with people. I think that's really valuable as well. Being there to help, you know, in developing relationships with single moms and that kind of thing.
Awesome. I have one more question for you. Yeah. It's maybe a softball question, but not that it's about softball. I know very little about sports, so it wouldn't be able to be about softball, but meaning that it's probably not a hard question to respond to, but something that
question.
Something that I think we all process through is regardless of where we land in our views on the government and politics, it's a complicated conversation to have with anyone. And we're getting ready to head into the holiday season where we'll be confronted with people that either agree or disagree and have lots of thoughts on all of that. How do we enter into those conversations in a Christ-like way, you know, in a way that helps bring some awareness? I mean, some of the stuff that you share with us today is appalling. And I want to go back and say, well, did you know about this? And did you know this? But I know that sometimes that just leads to further arguments and frustration. And so how do we go about, now you're going to be my therapist, but how do we go about like thinking more like, how do we talk about this in the church in a way that unites and doesn't divide?
Right. Well, you know, there's going to be some families or friends where you can't even do it. It's like, just let's not even talk about it. But I find more often than not that there's something you can agree with people on. You know, I'm moderate in my views, believe it or not, but let's say somebody's at an extreme on either side, there's something you agree on, and you talk about that issue and how to work together. How should we be thinking of, you know, the crazy thing is that the statistics show that the huge majority of Americans are moderate and agree on a number of issues. And in this research I did, even though the majority of Christians blame the poor for their poverty, something like 95% of all people said the government should get involved. That blew my mind.
Yeah, so, that's a lot higher than I would have expected. That's incredible.
I mean, because people are like, this is a crisis, you know, something has to happen. So once they hear the statistics, so of course people have different ways they'd like to see the government get involved, but there's ways to work together on the stuff we care about, and you end up feeling good after these conversations with people who might be on the opposite spectrum of you, when you come away from, we both care about kids, we both care about, everybody cares about poverty, you know, like poor kids, they may blame people for it, but they are interested in how to solve some of these issues. Not everybody cares, but a lot of people care. So yeah, I think that's what I try to do. And then if there's just no hope, don't talk about it, you know?
I think that's exactly right. I think we got to find common ground. And I think we're at a place as a country where we got to find some common ground and make an impact. So thank you, Jyl, for your time today. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for your heart. Again, I do have a copy of Jill's dissertation. So if people want to read that, feel free to email me, or I can tell you where to get it online so that she gets points, check marks every time somebody downloads it. So feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Thanks so much for watching this Church Goes Global webinar. We hope it's been a helpful conversation for you and for your church.